What if the gods didn't just watch from distant heavens, but walked the same streets where humans bought bread and sold pottery? What if divine beings lived in houses at the center of ancient cities, ate meals prepared by human hands, and spoke directly to kings who trembled before them? Tonight, we're stepping into a world where the boundary between mortal and divine wasn't a distant theological concept, but an everyday reality that shaped every aspect of existence. Before you get comfortable, let me give you a quick idea of what this channel is really about. I make sleep documentaries on the Anunnaki and the Sumerians because these old mysteries deserve to be explored gently, without all the wild headlines or heavy academic language that can make your brain shut down. I want your mind to wander, not get boxed in. If that's your kind of thing, hit subscribe and leave a like. That way, these stories find more people who look up at the night sky and wonder where we came from, just like you do. All right, go ahead, turn down the lights, settle in, let the noise of the day drift away. Picture this. We're in Uruk at dawn, the first sunlight catching the top of a ziggurat that stands like a mountain on the wide, flat plain. We're walking temple courtyards where priests cook meals for beings they're sure are close by, watching and listening. We're about to step into a world where gods aren't just ideas or distant powers. They're neighbors. They have homes, tastes, and some pretty human habits. It's around 3200 BCE. We're in southern Mesopotamia, in the era archaeologists call the Uruk period, named for the greatest city of its day. The first real urban civilization is taking shape in this land between two rivers. But if you ask the people living here, they wouldn't say it was just human effort. No, this whole thing is a partnership. This is the age when the Anunnaki walk among the Sumerians, when heaven and earth overlap and gods need houses, so people build them. Now imagine you're standing at the edge of Uruk just after sunrise. The city sprawls before you, bigger than anything humans have built before. 6 miles of huge walls made from millions of mud bricks, each one shaped by hand and baked dry under the brutal sun. Inside, maybe 50,000 people are waking up. Smoke curls from breakfast fires, pottery wheels spin, looms clack away, merchants shout their prices. And in the center, towering over everything, there's the White Temple. It sits on a 40-foot platform, its gypsum-plastered walls catching the morning light and almost glowing. This isn't just a building. It's a house, a real residence. It's where Inanna lives, goddess of love and war, the planet Venus, everything beautiful and everything dangerous. The people who built it, who keep it running, who bring gifts to its doors every day, they don't see it as a symbol. No, to them, she actually lives here. That belief, the absolute conviction that gods lived in their cities and moved through real spaces, shaped everything in Sumerian life. The temple wasn't some separate, sacred place. It was the center of it all. The heart, the reason the city even existed. So let's walk through those gates together. We step into the outer courtyard, where people wait and hope for a word with the temple staff, the priests who speak for Inanna. The stone under your feet is smooth from generations of footsteps. The walls shimmer with cone mosaics, thousands of painted clay pegs arranged in hypnotic patterns of red, black, and white. The air is thick with the scent of incense, juniper and cedar brought from far-off mountains. There's fresh bread from the temple ovens, beer bubbling in huge jars, livestock waiting in pens for sacrifice. Dozens of people move with purpose. Scribes carry clay tablets, tracking everything that comes and goes. Shepherds herd animals toward the slaughter yards. Women haul baskets of dates and grain. Musicians tune up for the evening hymns. This isn't just a place to pray. The temple complex is a powerhouse. It owns farmland that stretches for miles outside the city. It employs hundreds, farmers, herders, weavers, potters, brewers, bakers, scribes, musicians, guards. It acts like a bank, storing wealth and giving out loans. It's a trading hub, swapping local grain for Lebanese timber, Anatolian copper, Afghan lapis lazuli. But here's the thing that sets it apart from anything modern. Everything, absolutely everything, happens here because of Inanna. The fields grow because she blesses them. Trade succeeds because she protects it. Workers get rations because, through her priests, she provides them. She's the spiritual heart and the economic engine. She's here. She's present, she's watching. We climb the stairs toward the inner sanctum. With each step the human world falls away. The noise of the city fades, the air grows cooler. Guards stand at each level, their faces impassive, their bronze-tipped spears catching the light. Not everyone can ascend these stairs. Access is controlled, hierarchical. You need permission. You need purity. You need to belong to the select few who can approach the divine without being destroyed by proximity to such power. At the top, in the innermost chamber, sits the cult statue of Inanna. She is made of precious materials, gold, lapis lazuli, carnelian. Her eyes are shell and bitumen, and they seem to follow you as you enter. She is smaller than you might expect, perhaps 3 feet tall, but her presence fills the room. This is not art. This is not representation. To the priests who care for her, this is Inanna herself, manifest in physical form, dwelling among her people. Every morning before dawn, priests enter this chamber and perform the ritual of awakening. They open the doors to the statue's shrine with hymns and prayers. They wash her face with water brought from sacred springs. They dress her in fine linen robes, changed daily. They anoint her with precious oils. They place food before her, bread, dates, beer, meat from freshly sacrificed animals. And they believe with absolute certainty that she consumes the spiritual essence of these offerings. The physical substance remains, and it will later be distributed to temple personnel, but Inanna has eaten. The goddess has been fed. This daily feeding of the gods was one of the most important rituals in Sumerian religion. It wasn't symbolic, it was practical. The gods needed sustenance just as humans did. They had appetites, they had preferences. Some gods preferred beef, others mutton. Some liked beer with particular herbs. The temple administrators kept meticulous records of what each deity consumed, tracking it with the same precision they used for tracking grain shipments and textile production. But wait, stop for a moment and consider what this means. The Sumerians believed that beings of immense power, beings who controlled the forces of nature and human destiny, required daily meals. They believed these beings lived in houses that needed to be maintained, cleaned, repaired. They believed the gods had bodies that needed care, clothing that needed changing, faces that needed washing. This is not the distant, abstract divinity of later monotheistic traditions. This is something else entirely. This is gods who are present, embodied, vulnerable in certain ways to physical needs. And this presence shaped everything about how Sumerians understood their relationship to the divine realm. The architecture of divine dwelling, ziggurats, as bridges between worlds. Look out over Uruk and you can't miss the ziggurat towering above everything else. But honestly, it's not the only one. Ancient Mesopotamia is full of these giant, stepped platforms jutting up from the flat, muddy land. Every big city has its own. Eridu, the oldest of them all, where Enki's temple sits above the cosmic waters. Nippur, the heart of religion, where Enlil rules from his mountain house. And where people still talk about the moon god Nanna's ziggurat, its ruins refusing to crumble even after 4,000 years. People like to compare these to pyramids, but that's not right. Pyramids are tombs. They're sealed up, built for the dead. Ziggurats are something else entirely, living temples meant for the gods to actually inhabit. You're not supposed to break in, you're supposed to make the climb. The whole ritual is about moving upward, from the dust of earth to the edge of heaven. Picture the ziggurat at It's massive. 3 huge tiers, each painted its own color. The bottom is black, built from bitumen. The next one's red, covered in clay. The top tier, white, shining under that brutal sun thanks to gypsum. All this supports a small temple on the very top, almost modest compared to the platform beneath it. Inside, priests keep up the moon god's house, tending to the inner sanctum where Nanna is supposed to dwell. 3 broad staircases run up the front. They meet at the first platform. Then a single stair leads the rest of the way up. The design forces everyone into a ritual. You pick your staircase, join up with others, and finish the climb together. You can't just charge straight to the top, you have to follow the pattern. Climbing those stairs isn't just a workout. Every step takes you through a different world. Down below is chaos and noise, regular life. But as you climb, you rise through the layers, black for the earth, dark and fertile, red for the realm of air and storms and Lil's domain, then white, the color of the heavens, pure and untouched. When you finally reach the summit, lungs burning, you're higher than anything else for miles. The city spreads out beneath you, walls, alleys, clusters of smaller temples. Outside the city, green fields stretch toward the horizon, crisscrossed by irrigation canals. Farther out, the desert waits, always threatening. But you're not just here for the view. This is the meeting place, the spot where earth and sky touch. Humans built this artificial mountain, hauling mud bricks year after year so the gods could come down and people could reach up. It's a threshold, a border, a kind of cosmic gate. The temple at the top, surprisingly small, maybe 30 feet on a side but built sturdy, with thick walls and decorated with little cones and niches. Inside, it's a maze of rooms, storerooms for ritual gear, changing areas for priests, and right in the center, the holiest chamber, where Nana's statue sits. Only the highest priests step foot in there. And in that sacred heart, there's a bed. Not just any bed, a carefully crafted one, covered with fresh linens every day, always facing east to greet the sunrise and Eridu, Nana's son. The Sumerians believed Nana would rest here during his monthly absence from the sky, coming down from the heavens to sleep, to be honored, and to enjoy the care of his priests. Archaeologists digging into these ziggurats found something interesting. Nobody finished the whole thing in a single go. Each generation added their own layer, rebuilt, or expanded, always respecting the original layout. At they found clear evidence, multiple construction phases, each one stacking up on the last. It almost feels like every new generation was determined to climb a little higher, to make the link between humans and gods even stronger, even more lasting. Or maybe they were just following instructions, ancient blueprints handed down from the days when the gods themselves supposedly taught people how to build a proper home for the divine. The precision of these structures is remarkable. The corners of the ziggurat align to the cardinal directions with less than 1 degree of error. This wasn't accident. This was deliberate, requiring sophisticated astronomical observation and surveying techniques. The builders knew exactly where true north lay. They knew how to measure angles. They knew how to create level platforms from millions of mud bricks. They possessed engineering knowledge that seems disproportionate to what we typically imagine when we think about ancient societies. And they used this knowledge to build houses for gods, not for human glory, not for royal aggrandizement, though kings certainly gained prestige from sponsoring these projects. They built ziggurats because the gods needed earthly dwellings, and the gods deserved the very best that human skill could create. Inside the temple at the summit, priests maintained a constant ritual schedule. Every day began with the awakening ceremony. The statue of Nana was greeted with hymns, washed, dressed, fed. Throughout the day, additional offerings were made at prescribed times. Incense was burned. Music was performed. Prayers were recited. In the evening, the god was prepared for sleep, given a final meal, dressed in night garments, and left to rest. This wasn't symbolic performance. This was service. The priests understood themselves as servants in the household of a divine master. Their role was to maintain the god's comfort, to ensure his needs were met, to keep his dwelling clean and pleasant and worthy of his presence. They did this work with the same attention to detail that a modern servant might bring to caring for a wealthy patron, except their patron controlled the moon's movements, governed the fertility of fields and livestock, and determined human fates. The temple complex included far more than just the summit shrine. At the base of the ziggurat spread a vast array of supporting structures, kitchens where offerings were prepared, workshops where ritual implements were crafted and repaired, storehouses filled with grain, oil, wool, and other commodities, breweries producing the beer that gods and humans both consumed, bakeries producing the bread that formed the foundation of every meal. Scribal schools where young men learned to write, mastering the complex cuneiform script that allowed civilization to keep records and transmit knowledge across generations. All of this activity, all of this economic production, all of this human labor existed to support one primary function: maintaining the divine household, keeping the god fed, clothed, housed, and honored. Everything else was secondary. But here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't a one-way relationship. The gods didn't just receive service, they reciprocated. The temple, acting as the god's agent, redistributed resources throughout the community. Workers received rations, priests received salaries, craftspeople were paid for their products. The temple sponsored festivals that fed the entire city. It provided welfare for widows and orphans. It operated as a kind of social safety net, ensuring that at least some basic level of support existed for the most vulnerable members of society. In modern terms, we might call this a temple economy or a redistributive system, but the Sumerians understood it differently. This was divine generosity flowing from the god's household to the human community. Nana, through his earthly administrators, was caring for his people the way a good patriarch cares for his extended family. And when catastrophe struck, when floods destroyed crops, when drought withered fields, when plague killed livestock, when enemy armies threatened the city, the temple served as a rallying point. Prayers intensified, offerings multiplied. The entire community turned to their divine patron with desperate appeals for intervention. And sometimes, if the texts are to be believed, intervention came. The flood waters receded just before breaching the walls. The rains arrived after months of drought. The enemy army turned back for reasons their generals couldn't explain. Were these natural coincidences, random fluctuations in weather and human behavior that the Sumerians interpreted through their theological framework? Or were they responses to prayer, genuine divine intervention in human affairs? We can't know. We're separated from these events by over 4,000 years. We have only the written records the Sumerians left behind, records that unanimously insist the gods were real, present, active participants in human history. Records that describe divine human interaction with the same matter-of-fact tone they used to describe everything else. What we can know is this: the ziggurat wasn't just a building. It was a statement in brick and bitumen that the gods dwelt among humans, that the boundary between heaven and earth could be crossed, that divine and mortal realms were in constant communication. And this belief shaped everything about how Sumerian civilization organized itself. When heaven touched earth, the antediluvian city states, and their divine patrons. Way before Ur built its famous ziggurat, before Uruk took its turn as the world's biggest city, the Sumerians believed there were 5 original cities, the true firsts. These weren't just legends. You can find them in old texts, and archaeologists have even dug up some of them. But Sumerian tradition says these 5 cities belong to a different era, a time before the Great Flood, when gods and humans mixed more freely than they ever would again. The texts call these places the antediluvian cities, the ones from before the flood. Eridu came first, the spot where kingship dropped down from the heavens. Then Bedtime, home to metal workers and their craft. Uruk, a city that's mostly still a mystery. Nippur, the city of the sun god Eridu. And Uruk, where the survivor of the flood, think Sumerian Noah, lived before the disaster hit. Each city had its own divine guardian, an Anunnaki who claimed it as their turf. Enki ruled Eridu. Dumuzi watched over Bedtime. Pabalsag took care of Uruk. Udu held Nippur. Sud claimed Uruk. These gods weren't distant figures either. Sumerians imagined them actually living in the city, running things hands-on. Eridu stands out among them. The Sumerian king list, a wild mix of myth and early history, starts off by saying, after kingship came down from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. That's it. No explanation, just an assertion. Sumerians didn't think kingship was something people invented. They thought it arrived as a gift, or maybe a command from the gods straight to Eridu. When archaeologists dug into Eridu, they found something surprising. At the bottom, way down in layers dating to around 5400 BCE, there was just a tiny shrine. One small room, an altar, a niche for offerings. But then, right on top of that first shrine, someone built a second, slightly bigger temple. Then another and another. 18 temples stacked up over 2,000 years, each one built right on the same spot, facing the same direction, following the same basic plan, each just a little bigger than the last. Generation after generation, people in Eridu kept rebuilding the temple on the same sacred ground. It started off small, barely room for one priest, and eventually became a huge complex, towering over the city. But the original spot never moved. The direction stayed the same. They believed Enki himself picked that place at the dawn of time, and they honored it by never changing it. The final temple, built around 3000 BCE, was called the Iabzu, the House of the Cosmic Deep. The name says a lot. This was supposed to be the spot where the first fresh waters, the Abzu, the stuff of creation, came up from below the earth. Enki, the wise god of sweet water, had his palace there, reaching down into the hidden depths. Picture what it felt like to be a priest in that temple. You do your rituals up in the sunlight, wash the statue, leave the offerings, chant your hymns. But everyone knew that underneath the floor, deep underground, there were chambers and tunnels going down into the Abzu. That's where Enki really lived. You were standing right on the edge between the safe, orderly world of people and the raw chaos that came before everything. Old texts describe Enki's palace in the Abzu with real flair. Foundations of lapis lazuli and silver, golden walls, giant doors only a god could open. Inside, Enki kept the mysterious rules or maybe magical technologies that shaped all of civilization. Knowledge itself was down there, guarded by the god who loved humans and taught them how to live together. When priests went down into the lower parts of the temple, and archaeologists have actually found underground rooms in these ruins, though it's still a bit of a puzzle what they were for. They believed they were getting close to Enki's real home. They were crossing into sacred territory. You had to be clean, say the right words, prove you deserved to be there. And sometimes, if we trust the old stories, Enki didn't just stay hidden. He emerged from those depths, walked in the courtyards, gave advice to kings, taught scribes their craft. He handed out building plans, showed people how to dig canals, solved problems nobody else could crack. This pattern, a god dwelling in a specific city, in a specific temple, emerging to interact directly with humans, repeated across all 5 antediluvian cities. In Sippar, Udu the sun god resided in his temple Babar, the White House, so called because it was plastered with white gypsum that gleamed in sunlight like Udu's own blazing disk. Every morning, priests performed rituals to welcome Udu as he began his daily journey across the sky. Every evening, they prepared for his departure to the underworld, where he would travel at night to judge the dead before rising again at dawn. But here's something the texts emphasize. Udu didn't just exist as a celestial phenomenon, as the sun that moved across the sky. He also existed as a personal presence in Sippar, dwelling in his temple, receiving visitors, dispensing justice to those who appealed to him for legal decisions. The cosmic force and the embodied deity were somehow the same being, existing simultaneously in multiple modes. This dual nature of the gods, both natural forces and personal beings, characterized Sumerian theology. Inanna was the planet Venus, appearing as the morning and evening star. But she was also a goddess with a personality, emotions, preferences, who lived in Uruk and involved herself intimately in human affairs. Nanna was the moon, cycling through its phases in the night sky. But he was also a god dwelling in resting in his temple, requiring daily service from his priests. The Sumerians never seemed to have been troubled by this duality. To them, it was obvious that a god could be both a cosmic force operating at universal scale and a personal being occupying specific locations and interacting with individuals. The categories we use, natural versus supernatural, impersonal force versus personal deity, simply didn't apply in their worldview. The divine could be both, was both, without contradiction. In the antediluvian cities, this dual nature was on full display. The gods were present in their temples, yes, but they were also present in the natural phenomena they governed. Enki was in the Eridu temple, but he was also in every spring and river, in the fresh water that made agriculture possible. Udu was in Sippar, but he was also in the sun that rose each morning. The goddess Sud was in Shurapak, but she was also in the grain that fed the city. This presence, this multiple, simultaneous presence, meant that worship wasn't directed to distant beings who might or might not be listening. Worship was directed to gods who were verifiably, observably present. You could see Udu crossing the sky every day. You could drink the water Enki provided. You could eat the grain Sud blessed. And you could visit their temples, leave offerings, speak to their priests, and trust that your words were being heard by beings who were actually there, in that building, in that city, in your world. The antediluvian age, according to Sumerian tradition, ended with the Great Flood. The texts are clear about this. Divine patience with humanity ran out. The gods, disturbed by human noise and proliferation, decided to destroy their creation. Only one family survived, warned by Enki, who couldn't bring himself to let all humanity perish. After the flood, the texts tell us, kingship descended from heaven again. The 5 sacred cities were rebuilt or replaced by new centers. The age of direct, unmediated divine-human interaction ended. The gods withdrew somewhat, putting more distance between themselves and mortals. They still dwelt in temples. They still required service. They still involved themselves in human affairs. But something had changed. The boundary between heaven and earth, which had been almost non-existent in the antediluvian age, became firmer, less permeable. Yet the memory of that earlier age persisted. The Sumerians remembered, or claimed to remember, a time when gods walked among humans even more freely than in their own day. When divine presence was so intense, so immediate, that human kings could live for thousands of years, drawing longevity from their proximity to immortal beings. When cities were founded by gods themselves, not just placed under divine patronage after human establishment. This memory shaped everything about Sumerian civilization. They understood themselves as living in a diminished age, a time of separation and loss. The glorious past when Anunnaki walked freely among their ancestors was gone, but it could be remembered, it could be honored, and most importantly, it could be partially recreated through proper ritual, correct temple construction, faithful service to the gods. The ziggurats, the temple complexes, the elaborate daily rituals, all of this was an attempt to maintain the connection, to keep the gods present even though they no longer walked the streets as openly as before. The Sumerians were fighting against entropy, against the tendency of the divine to recede from the human world, and they fought with architecture and ritual and unwavering devotion. The semi-divine kings, when Anunnaki blood ran in mortal veins. In Sumerian thinking, the line between gods and humans wasn't always sharp. Some figures sat right in that gray area, sharing traits from both sides. Kings, especially the earliest ones, stood out here. They often traced their bloodlines back to the gods, claiming divine ancestry as part of their right to rule. The Sumerian king list spells this out pretty openly. Some kings show up as sons of specific gods, but what did that actually mean? Were these kings literally born from gods and mortals? Or did son just mean they were chosen or adopted by gods, maybe as a way to boost their status? Or was it just a fancy way to say, hey, the gods support me? It's tricky, but sometimes the texts seem to take these claims at face value. Gilgamesh, probably the most famous king of Uruk, is a good example. They called him 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. His mother, Ninsun, a goddess. His father, Lugalbanda, a mortal king who later became a god himself. That 2/3 god math feels serious, Like the Sumerians saw divinity as something you could inherit through blood, not just a title. So what does being two-thirds divine get you? Well, for Gilgamesh, it meant he was nothing like ordinary people. He was huge, unbelievably strong, stunning to look at. He did things no one else could, like killing Humbaba, the monster guarding the cedar forest, or slaying the bull of heaven. He even traveled to the world's edge hunting for immortality, facing dangers that would have crushed any normal human. But he still died. That's the heartbreaking part of his story. All that divine blood, all that power, and still, mortality wins. Two-thirds God wasn't enough to dodge death. Only the full gods live forever. Gilgamesh watched his friend Enkidu die, saw decay up close, and realized what waited for him too. In the end, he came home to Uruk, settled for the immortality of his name and his city's walls. This tragedy of heroes stuck between divinity and humanity shows up all over Sumerian stories. Take Dumuzi, the shepherd who became Inanna's lover. Some versions say he started out human or half-divine. Didn't matter. He died and got trapped in the underworld, caught in a cycle of death and returned tied to the seasons. Even as a god, he couldn't escape death completely. So Sumerians seem to say, sure, divine-human hybrids can exist, but it's a rough spot to be in. They're better than regular people, stronger, longer-lived, more capable, but still not immune to death. That divine spark gets watered down in a human body and can't beat the final limit. The king list's oldest rulers, the antediluvian kings, push this idea to the extreme. Their reigns last tens of thousands of years. Ululim rules for 28,800 years, Alaulgar for 36,000. It's like they had so much divine blood they almost cheated death. Almost, but not quite. Even these kings die eventually, making way for the next in line. After the flood, the king list tells a different story. The early post-flood kings still live for hundreds or a few thousand years, but the numbers drop fast. The first king of Kish gets 1,200 years, his son 960, and so on. By the time we hit real historical rulers, around 2500 BCE, the numbers look normal, a few decades just like you'd expect. Maybe that's just myth fatting into history, legends giving way to actual records. But the Sumerians probably saw something else, a slow draining of divine blood from the royal family. Each generation, the spark got weaker. Lifespans shrank as the gods' legacy faded from human veins. Some kings tried to bring it back. They married priestesses tied to the gods, hoping their kids would inherit some divine favor. They built temples, poured out offerings, and prayed for longer lives or superhuman strength. Some insisted the gods had adopted them, even if they weren't born from divine parents. Anything to keep that special connection alive. The most dramatic expression of this desire for divine connection was the sacred marriage ritual, practiced extensively in Sumerian cities. During major festivals, the king would ritually marry the high priestess of Inanna. She represented the goddess herself in this ceremony. The king represented Dumuzi, Inanna's original divine consort. Through their union, performed in the temple's inner sanctum, the king temporarily became Dumuzi. He merged with the divine, crossing the boundary between human and God, if only for one sacred night. The texts describing these rituals are remarkably explicit. They're not vague spiritual metaphors. They describe actual sexual union, performed as sacred act, designed to ensure the fertility of the land and the prosperity of the city. The priestess as Inanna receives the king as Dumuzi in the god's bedchamber. Their joining mirrors the cosmic marriage that brings fertility to the earth. And for that night, participants believed the king genuinely partook of divine nature. Was this sympathetic magic? Humans play-acting divine roles in hope that reality would conform to the ritual? Or did the Sumerians believe that through correct ritual, the priestess actually became Inanna, the king actually became Dumuzi, and their union was literally the cosmic marriage being reenacted on Earth? The texts don't make this distinction clear because the Sumerians themselves may not have made it. In their understanding, Ritual performance that was done correctly, with proper intention and divine approval, didn't just represent reality. It participated in reality. It made real what it represented. The priestess wasn't just representing Inanna. Through the ritual transformation, she was Inanna, embodied in human form, present in the physical world. This concept, that humans could temporarily become gods through ritual, appears throughout Mesopotamian religious practice. Priests performing daily temple rituals didn't just serve the god statue. During the ritual, they believed the statue was the god, fully present, conscious, aware. The food they presented wasn't symbolically offered. It was actually consumed, its spiritual essence at least, by the deity residing in the statue. When a new king was crowned, elaborate rituals transformed him from a mortal man into a sacred being. He was anointed with holy oil. He was dressed in special garments that marked his divine office. He was crowned with a specific type of headdress that only gods and god-kings could wear. He was given the royal scepter and ring, symbols of divine authority granted from heaven. Through these ritual acts, he became something more than human. Not fully divine, but not merely mortal either. The phrase used in coronation texts is revealing. The king receives the radiant aura of kingship. This melamu, this divine radiance, was understood as a real thing, a kind of spiritual energy or light that emanated from gods and from those who had been touched by divine power. Kings possessed melamu. So did important priests. So did sacred objects and places. It was visible to those with spiritual sight as a glowing aura that marked the presence of the holy. When kings died, their relationship with divinity continued. The greatest kings were deified after death, granted temples and cult worship just like the original gods. Gilgamesh became a judge in the underworld, one of the Anunnaki himself, receiving offerings from generations of Sumerians who honored him as divine ancestor. Other kings were believed to join the gods in heaven, becoming stars or celestial beings who watched over their cities from above. This fluidity of the boundary between human and divine meant that the Anunnaki weren't a completely closed category. New members could join through various processes, exceptional humans being granted divine status, divine human hybrids being born, mortals transforming through ritual or after death. The divine realm was permeable from below, just as it was permeable from above when gods descended to walk among humans. But always, there was the awareness of hierarchy. Even semi-divine kings, even the greatest heroes, even humans who achieved some measure of divine status, remained inferior to the true Anunnaki. The gap between a king with divine ancestry and Enlil or Enki was vast. The gap between a human granted divine honors after death and Inanna or Uruk was unbridgeable. The Anunnaki were the great gods, the senior deities, the beings who had existed since the cosmos was formed. Humans who touched divinity did so only because the Anunnaki permitted it, because they chose to share some measure of their essence with mortal bloodlines, because they descended from their celestial heights to walk among Sumerians and leave lasting traces of their presence. The daily rhythm of divine service, life in the temple complex. It's dawn in ancient Uruk. The city still shadowed, just a faint line of sunlight brushing the top of the ziggurats' white temple. But inside Inanna's temple, the day's already started. Priests and priestesses are busy. They're getting ready for the most important ritual of the day, waking the goddess. Let's go with them. Think about what it meant, serving a god you believed was really there, alive, aware, depending on you for care. The high priest goes in first, alone, stepping into the inner sanctum. It's a small room, maybe 15 feet square, walls covered in intricate red, black, and white patterns. Right in the center sits Inanna's cult statue, completely hidden under linen cloth. She sleeps like this every night. The high priest walks up and starts to sing, his voice filling the quiet room. Great Lady of Heaven, the morning has come. The night has passed. Awake, O Queen of the sacred temple. Your servants stand ready to attend you. He kneels and lifts away the night coverings. Underneath, Inanna's statue comes into view, gold shining in the lamp's glow, eyes of lapis lazuli that almost seem to open and see him. His hands tremble a little. They always do at this part. No matter how many times he does this, the feeling never fades. He honestly believes he's waking someone real, that she's looking right through him, totally aware. Two junior priests follow, carrying a basin of water from a sacred spring miles outside the city. This water's precious, carried all the way here in sealed jars by servants who stayed pure for the whole journey. It's not just water, it's holy enough to touch a goddess. The high priest dips a linen cloth in the water and gently washes the statue's face. He murmurs the old words, the ones priests have used forever. Pure water from the pure source. Water that flowed before cities were built. Water blessed by Enki in the depths. This cleanses you, O Holy One. Now more priests come in with fresh clothes. Time to dress the statue, new linen, layer after layer, each one wrapped in a special way. Then the belt, shining with precious metal. Jewelry follows, necklaces, bracelets, anklets made from gold, silver, carnelian, lapis lazuli. Every piece has its place. The ritual's exact, no room for mistakes. Next, the offerings arrive. Priests and priestesses form a procession, each holding something. Warm bread from the temple ovens, dates stacked on golden trays, beer in silver cups, roasted sheep from a sacrifice just an hour ago. Its blood drained by strict rules, its meat prepared by cooks who kept themselves pure. They lay everything out before the statue. The high priest says the words. To Inanna, Lady of Uruk, we present the bread of life, the beer of abundance, the sweet fruit of the date palm, the meat of the sacred flock. Accept these offerings, O Queen, and bless your city with prosperity. Then silence falls. Everyone but the high priest leaves. He stands just watching. People believe Inanna now takes in the spirit of the offerings. The food stays on the table untouched, but its essence, its true nourishment, belongs to the goddess. How long does this take? The ritual texts aren't specific. Long enough for the goddess to eat, the priests believed. Perhaps an hour. The high priest waits, praying silently, maintaining focus. His role is to be present during this consumption, to guard the sacred meal, to ensure nothing disturbs the goddess while she dines. Finally, he recites the closing formula, thanking Inanna for accepting the offerings. Servants enter and remove the food from the divine table. It will now be distributed among temple personnel. The priests will eat this bread, drink this beer, consume this meat. It's still sacred, still powerful, but the goddess has finished with it. Her servants may now receive her leavings as blessing. This daily rhythm, awakening, washing, dressing, feeding, continued year after year, century after century in temples across Mesopotamia. It was the heartbeat of Sumerian religion, the foundation of the relationship between gods and humans. Everything else, the grand festivals, the royal dedications, the crisis prayers during famines or invasions, all of that was secondary to this daily service. The temple complex that supported these rituals was vast and complex. Imagine walking through it at midday. The central temple where the cult statue resides is just one structure among dozens. There are workshops where craftsmen produce ritual objects. You pass through a courtyard where potters work at their wheels, creating the countless vessels needed for offerings and storage. The clay is local, dug from the banks of the Euphrates, but the skill required to turn it into perfectly symmetrical bowls and jars and cups takes years to develop. These potters are specialists, employed by the temple, their entire lives dedicated to producing objects for divine service. In another workshop, weavers work at enormous looms, creating the textiles that clothe the goddess and her priests. The thread is linen, imported from Egypt at enormous cost, or wool from the temple's own flocks. The patterns woven into these cloths are traditional, unchanged for generations. Geometric designs in natural dyes, red from madder, blue from woad, yellow from saffron. Each color has meaning. Each pattern has significance. A jewelry workshop produces the ornaments that adorn the cult statues. Smiths worked gold and silver, heating the metals to malleability, hammering them into thin sheets, cutting and shaping them into elaborate designs. Lapidary specialists cut and polished semi-precious stones, carnelian, agate, jasper, lapis lazuli, setting them into gold bezels with precision that would impress modern jewelers. You pass through the temple breweries, where massive clay jars contain fermenting beer. The smell is sour, yeasty, strong. Beer is the common drink of Mesopotamia, consumed by gods and humans alike. The temple produces thousands of gallons annually, most of it for offerings and for distribution to temple workers as part of their rations. The bakeries produce an equally staggering volume of bread. Stone ovens burn constantly, fueled by dung and straw. Bakers work in shifts, kneading dough, shaping loaves, tending the fires. The bread is basic: barley, flour, water, salt, but it sustains the hundreds of people who work in the temple complex. Beyond the workshops lie the administrative quarters. Here, scribes sit in rows, bent over clay tablets, recording everything. Every sheep that enters the temple precinct is counted and recorded. Every jar of beer produced is noted. Every distribution of rations to workers is documented. The precision is remarkable. Nothing escapes accounting. These scribal records, thousands of which have been excavated and translated, reveal the economic scale of temple operations. The temple of Inanna at Uruk controlled tens of thousands of acres of agricultural land. It owned flocks numbering in the tens of thousands of sheep and goats. It employed hundreds of workers in various capacities: farmers, herders, craftsmen, laborers, guards, musicians, scribes, priests. The institution wasn't just wealthy. It was probably the single largest economic entity in the city, perhaps in the entire region. Its resources exceeded those of any individual, even the king. The temple could undertake projects that no one else could: building massive irrigation canals, sponsoring long-distance trade expeditions, feeding the population during famines. But remember, all of this wealth, all of this economic power belonged to Inanna. The temple administrators were stewards, managing the goddess's property on her behalf. The workers were her servants. The agricultural production from temple lands was her harvest. The trade goods stored in temple warehouses were her possessions. When the temple distributed rations to workers, Inanna was feeding her household. When it sponsored building projects, Inanna was improving her city. When it sent trade missions to distant lands, Inanna was acquiring the exotic materials she desired. The entire economic system operated on the principle that the goddess was present, aware, and actively managing her affairs through human intermediaries. This wasn't merely theological fiction. The Sumerians organized their entire economy around this principle. They developed sophisticated accounting systems to track divine property. They established legal frameworks for managing temple estates. They created administrative hierarchies to ensure proper management of resources that belonged to gods. And they believed, the texts make this absolutely clear, they believed that the gods cared about this management, that Inanna would be pleased if her estates were productive and displeased if they were mismanaged, that divine favor or divine anger could result from economic performance, not just from ritual correctness. There are texts describing gods appearing to temple administrators in dreams, giving instructions about agricultural planning or trade expeditions. There are accounts of gods expressing satisfaction or dissatisfaction with how their property was being managed. The economic and the spiritual weren't separate spheres. They were integrated aspects of a single system where divine beings lived among humans and involved themselves in every aspect of existence. As evening approaches, the temple complex prepares for the sunset ritual. The goddess must be prepared for sleep, given her evening meal, dressed in night garments. Musicians gather in the courtyard, ready to perform the evening hymns that honor Inanna as the evening star rises in the western sky. The boundary between divine and human realms is thinnest at twilight, the Sumerians believed. Dawn and dusk, those liminal times when day and night meet, when the sun crosses the horizon. These were moments of divine accessibility. Prayers offered at these times were more likely to be heard. Rituals performed at these transitions were more powerful. And so the hymns rise into the gathering darkness. Queen of evening, star of the western sky, as you descend to rest, bring peace to your city. Guard us through the night, O Lady of the sacred temple, until the morning returns, and your light shines forth again. The priests file out of the inner sanctum, leaving Inanna alone for the night. The doors are sealed. Guards take their positions. The goddess sleeps, and Uruk sleeps around her, the city quiet under the stars, confident in the protection of its divine patron who dwells at its heart. The Festivals, when the divine and human realms merged completely. 4 times a year, Uruk changed completely. The usual routines vanished, replaced by wild, city-wide festivals that pulled everyone, gods and mortals, into days of celebration that went way beyond the typical temple rituals. The biggest of all was Eridu, the New Year festival. For 12 days everything stopped. The city itself turned sacred. Everyone joined in, from the king in his palace down to the poorest worker. The rituals promised to reset the world's order, guarantee prosperity, and renew Uruk's bond with its gods. Picture it, the first morning of Eridu. You've been getting ready for weeks, washing your best tunic, patching up old sandals, stashing away food and beer for the feasts. Your kids barely sleep, too excited to sit still. The whole city hums with energy. At sunrise, the festival begins. Priests carry Inanna's statue out of her temple, a big, ornate version built just for processions, covered in extra jewelry for the day. 20 priests strain to lift the platform. They step through the temple gates into a packed courtyard. Thousands of people stand waiting. The crowd bursts into a song everyone knows by heart. Lady of the morning, Queen of the evening, you who make heaven and earth tremble, we greet you with joy. The parade starts. The route never changes, everyone knows it almost by instinct. People toss flowers as the statue passes. Some drop to their knees, some weep, others belt out hymns. Kids dart alongside, reaching out to brush the platform, hopping for a bit of the goddess's blessing. The king follows right behind Inanna, decked out in royal robes, holding all the symbols of his power. Behind him, the high priests. Then come the musicians, playing lyres, drums, pipes. Dancers spin and leap. Temple workers file in, and the rest of the city falls in behind, turning the whole thing into one huge river of people winding through Uruk streets. The parade heads for the Eridu house, a special temple just outside the city walls, built only for this festival. It's a long walk. By the time they get there, the crowd stretches back as far as you can see, a living snake of thousands moving together. At the Eridu house, the rituals keep going for days. Some are public, everyone can watch. Others happen behind closed doors, only for the priests. The strangest, most talked about part is the sacred marriage. On the festival's 6th night, the king and Inanna's high priestess act out the marriage of the goddess and her lover, Dumuzi. They disappear into a chamber in the Eridu house. No one else goes in, but the whole city knows what's happening. Outside, people keep vigil, chanting hymns, praying, staying up all night. Scholars have argued for ages about what really happened in that room. Some ritual texts are blunt, others mysterious. But one thing's clear, this wasn't just a performance. People truly believed that, through the ritual, the king became Dumuzi and the priestess became Inanna. Their union was the real thing, right here on earth, and it made the land and animals fertile for the year to come. Come sunrise, the king steps out. He's different, renewed in the eyes of everyone. The ritual, given him back his divine right to rule. Later that day, he takes on the last major ritual of Eridu, getting kingship back from Enlil. This part says a lot about how Sumerians saw their rulers. The king walks into Enlil's temple, And these temples were everywhere, not just for the city's main god. He strips off his crown, scepter, ring, everything that marks him as king. He stands in front of Enlil's statue. For a moment, he's just a man. Then the high priest of Enlil, speaking as if he's the god himself, slaps the king. Hard. The ritual texts are very clear. The slap needs to make the king cry. If he doesn't shed tears, the ceremony fails and disaster looms. Why do this? It's a reminder. The king is human, vulnerable, and only rules because the gods allow it. No matter how mighty he seems, his power comes from the divine. The gods can take it all away just as quickly as they gave it. If the tears flow properly, the priest recites the formula of renewal. Fear not, Enlil has heard your prayers. He will extend your reign. He will magnify your kingdom. The land will prosper under your rule. The king is then re-robed in his regalia. The crown is placed on his head again. He is renewed, reaffirmed, granted another year of divine mandate to rule. The entire population breathes a collective sigh of relief. The cosmic order is restored. The year can proceed safely. The final days of the Eridu festival involve massive public feasting. The temple distributes food on a scale that beggars imagination. Animals are slaughtered by the hundreds. Bread and beer flow freely. For these days, everyone eats well, regardless of social status. The goddess provides for her entire city. There's something profoundly important happening here beyond the obvious religious function. These festivals create social cohesion. They unite the population in shared experience. They break down hierarchies temporarily. During the festival, king and commoner sing the same hymns, eat the same sacred food, participate in the same rituals. They create collective memory, shared identity, bonds that make a collection of individuals into a genuine community. And at the center of it all is the goddess, not as abstract concept, not as distant force, but as living presence in their midst. The statue carried through the streets is Inanna herself, blessing her city, renewing her relationship with her people, demonstrating her continued choice to dwell among them. American archaeologists excavating festival temples in the early 20th century found evidence of just how important these events were. The Eridu houses were built on massive scales, designed to accommodate thousands of participants. Their courtyards could hold entire urban populations. Their storehouses could supply provisions for days of feasting. These weren't minor religious observances. They were the defining events of the year, the moments when the society renewed itself through divine contact. Other festivals marked different occasions. The sacred marriage could be performed multiple times per year, not just during Eridu. Each performance renewed fertility, ensured abundance, maintained the cosmic order. Harvest festivals celebrated successful crops with thanksgiving to the gods who provided them. New moon festivals honored Nana at the start of each lunar cycle. Solar festivals marked the solstices and equinoxes. The Sumerian calendar was essentially a festival calendar. Time was organized around these sacred events, not the reverse. The year didn't exist as abstract temporal framework within which religious events occasionally occurred. The year was the sequence of festivals, the cycle of divine encounters that gave structure and meaning to temporal passage. Between festivals, during the ordinary days, people worked and lived and died. But those ordinary days were always oriented toward the next festival, the next moment of divine human merger, the next opportunity for the community to come together in the presence of its gods and renew the covenant that made civilization possible. The slow withdrawal, when divinity began to recede asterisk. Something shifted, but the old Sumerian texts won't pin down exactly when. There's no clear before and after moment, no single event that marks the change. Still, if you read their literature in order, start with the earliest, move through the centuries, you can feel it. The gods start out close, almost neighborly, right there in the thick of things. Over time, that intimacy fades. The line between gods and mortals grows harder, thicker, harder to cross. In those first texts, back around 2600 BCE, the gods are everywhere. They wander city streets, talk to kings, chat with regular people, give advice, stir up trouble, fix problems, meddle in human business all the time. The boundary between heaven and earth, pretty thin. Fast forward a few centuries to 2000 BCE and you notice a shift. The gods aren't gone, but now you mostly hear from them by proxy, priests, omens, dreams that need an expert to untangle. Direct conversations happen less and less. The casual, everyday contact of the past slips out of reach. By 1500 BCE, the gods feel distant. They're powerful, yes, but far off. People approach them with more fear, more ritual, more caution. The relaxed, easy tone of earlier stories is gone, replaced by ceremony and anxiety. So what changed? If you ask the Sumerians, they might have said the gods themselves were pulling back, heading home to their celestial realms, less interested in walking among humans. The age when the Anunnaki strolled through the markets and palaces was ending. Now, reaching the gods took work, and keeping their attention meant even more ritual. Modern scholars see things another way. Maybe the shift mirrored changing politics. As kings became more powerful, almost godlike themselves, the gods, too, became more remote. Or maybe growing cities and bigger populations made the old stories of face-to-face encounters feel out of place. In a sprawling empire, it makes sense for the divine world to look more like a bureaucracy. But maybe it's simpler. Maybe something really did feel different. Maybe that sense of the gods' nearness, the feeling that they might step in at any moment, just faded little by little. The old closeness thinned out. The gap between heaven and earth stretched wider, and nobody knew exactly why. The flood story gives one reason. After the great deluge, after humans nearly vanished, the gods set new boundaries. They shortened lifespans, regulated births, set up more distance. The wild old days with gods and humans mixing freely were over for good. The world after the flood ran on new rules, with the gods holding themselves apart. Even so, the same pattern kept going. Each generation felt a little more separation, a little less access to the divine. Babylonian and Assyrian writers picked up Sumer's legacy and ran with it. By the first millennium BCE, the gods have gone fully transcendent, way up in heaven, speaking only through long, complicated rituals or priests. The stories of Anunnaki walking among people have turned into legends. Everyone remembers, but nobody expects it to happen anymore. Still, the people didn't give up. The temples stayed open, the ziggurats still towered over the cities. Every day, priests performed the old rituals, waking the gods, feeding them, putting them to bed. The machinery of divine connection kept running, even when the gods felt far away. Losing that close presence didn't make the Sumerians or their descendants stop trying. If the gods pulled away, humans built higher ziggurats. If the voices faded, they amplified the rituals. If the boundary thickened, they kept the gates open, just in case. This stubbornness, the refusal to let the gods slip away entirely, defined Mesopotamian religion for thousands of years. From the first Sumerian cities to Babylon's fall in 539 BCE, some things never changed. Gods lived in temples, demanded service, and played a part in people's lives, even if from a distance. The gods might have withdrawn, but the people never let go. And when that presence began to fade, when the gods began to withdraw, it was experienced as genuine loss. Not loss of belief. The Sumerians never stopped believing in their gods, but loss of immediate contact, loss of easy access, loss of the sense that divine beings were right there, in the temple at the city center, available to those who approached with proper ritual and pure intention. The texts from later periods express this loss with real poignancy. There are laments describing temples standing empty, gods having abandoned their dwellings, cities bereft of divine protection. These weren't mere literary tropes. They expressed genuine theological anxiety, real concern that the relationship between gods and humans, which had sustained civilization from its beginning, might be ending. Yet the relationship never fully ended. Even in the latest Mesopotamian texts, even as Persian and Greek and eventually Roman empires replaced native rule, the old gods remained in their temples. The rituals continued. Priests still awakened the divine statues each morning, still fed them, still maintained their houses. The forms persisted even as the intensity diminished. Perhaps this is what the Sumerians were trying to preserve. Not just theological doctrine or religious practice, but memory. Memory of a time when gods walked among humans, when divine presence was so intense it seemed normal, when the boundary between heaven and earth was so thin that crossing it required only climbing the stairs of a ziggurat. That memory shaped their architecture, their economy, their social organization, their art and literature, their entire understanding of what it meant to be human in a cosmos populated by powers vastly greater than themselves. Powers who, for reasons mysterious, had chosen to dwell among them, to share space with them, to involve themselves in human affairs with an intimacy that later ages would find almost unimaginable. The Anunnaki walked among Sumerians. The texts say this clearly, repeatedly, without qualification. Whether we understand that walking as literal, metaphorical, or something between, the Sumerians experienced it as real. They built their world around it. They oriented their entire civilization toward maintaining it. And even as divine presence faded, even as the gods withdrew to higher heavens and more distant abodes, the Sumerians kept faith with that original experience. They maintained the temples, performed the rituals, kept the gates open, hoping that what had once been immediate might someday be immediate again. That the gods who had walked among their ancestors might, in some future age, return to walk the earth once more. As you drift toward sleep tonight, let yourself imagine those ancient streets. The shadow of the ziggurat falling across the city in late afternoon light. The smell of incense from the temple courtyards. The sound of hymns rising at dawn. The certainty, absolute and unshakable, that gods were present, dwelling in houses built by human hands, requiring daily care, involving themselves in human lives with an intimacy we can barely conceive. The Sumerians are long gone. Their cities are ruins. Their language is dead, preserved only in clay tablets that scholars painstakingly translate. But the questions they grappled with remain. What does divine presence mean? How do humans relate to powers greater than themselves? What does it mean to build a civilization around the conviction that we're not alone, that the cosmos is populated by beings who care about us, who watch us, who involve themselves in our struggles and triumphs? These questions echo across millennia. They shape religions and philosophies still. They drive human longing for connection with something transcendent, something beyond the merely human. The Sumerians answered these questions in their own way, with ziggurats and temples and daily rituals of divine service. We answer them differently now, but we're still asking. Sleep well. The ancient world still whispers its truths to those willing to listen. The gods may have withdrawn from their earthly temples, but the memory of their presence remains, preserved in clay tablets and crumbling ruins, waiting for each new generation to discover and wonder, and ask the eternal questions about our place in a cosmos far stranger and more wondrous than we typically imagine. The language of the gods, when divine words shaped human reality. There's something the Sumerians understood that we've almost completely lost, the power of words when spoken with divine authority, not metaphorical power, not symbolic influence. Actual power to shape reality, to make things happen, to call into being what did not exist before. In Sumerian theology, when an Anunnaki spoke, reality listened. Divine speech wasn't mere communication of ideas. It was creative force, commanding authority, world-shaping power. The gods spoke and things came into being. They decreed and fates were determined. Their words had weight, substance, inevitability. This concept appears throughout Mesopotamian literature. In the Eridu Genesis, Enki speaks and cities are founded. In various hymns, Enlil commands and storms arise. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Shamas promises protection, and the sun god's word becomes an unbreakable oath that shapes subsequent events. Divine speech creates reality rather than merely describing it. The Sumerians developed an entire theological concept around this, the Me, which we've touched on before but deserves deeper exploration. These weren't just divine principles or cultural norms. They were, in Sumerian understanding, the fundamental patterns of existence encoded in language form, words spoken by the gods at creation that continue to structure reality. When Enki possessed the Me in his temple at Eridu, he wasn't holding abstract concepts. He possessed the actual formulas, the divine words that governed how civilization functioned. Kingship existed as Me, a specific set of divine words that defined what kingship was and how it operated. Priesthood was Me. Law was Me. Even specific crafts like metalworking and weaving existed as Me, divine speech patterns that enabled these activities to happen in the human realm. Inanna's theft of the Me from Enki, which we discussed earlier, takes on new significance when understood this way. She didn't steal ideas or cultural practices. She stole the actual creative words, the divine formulas that made civilization possible. By transporting them to Uruk, she literally brought the power to sustain advanced urban life to her city. Before she arrived with the Me, Uruk might have had people attempting kingship, priesthood, and various crafts. But without the divine words that defined and enabled these things, they would have been mere imitations, shadows of true civilization. This understanding of divine speech as creative power meant that human speech, when it participated in or invoked divine authority, could also shape reality. Prayer wasn't just asking the gods for favors. It was speaking words that, if done correctly, would compel divine response. Curses weren't merely wishes for someone's downfall. They were speech acts that activated supernatural forces to harm the cursed person. Blessings actually conveyed power and protection, not just good wishes. Temple rituals depended heavily on this principle. When priests recited the awakening hymn to Inanna each morning, they weren't just greeting her politely. They were speaking the words that actualized her presence, that called her into manifest being in the statue. The formula, "Awake, O Queen," wasn't description of something that might happen. It was the divine command, spoken with borrowed authority, that made awakening happen. Similarly, when the high priest spoke the presentation formula over the daily offerings, "To Inanna, Lady of Uruk, we present the bread of life," he wasn't announcing what he was doing. He was performing a speech act that transformed ordinary food into sacred offering, that made it acceptable for divine consumption. The words themselves did the transforming work. This gave priests tremendous responsibility. Speaking the wrong words or the right words incorrectly or the right words at the wrong time could have catastrophic consequences. Divine power invoked improperly could backfire, destroying the speaker or damaging the cosmic order. Temple personnel spent years learning correct pronunciation, proper intonation, appropriate timing. They memorized hundreds of formulas, practicing until every syllable was perfect. American archaeologists working at Nippur in the 1890s discovered vast libraries of ritual texts, tablet after tablet containing formulas for various ceremonies. The precision is remarkable. Instructions specify not just what to say, but how to say it. Pause here. Emphasize this word. Repeat this phrase 3 times. Face this direction. The ritualists who created these texts understood that divine speech required exact performance. Deviation wasn't just disrespectful. It was dangerous. When God spoke directly to humans, the experience was often described as overwhelming. In the Gilgamesh epic, when Shamas speaks to Gilgamesh, the hero is terrified despite being 2/3 divine himself. The sun god's voice carries power that mortal consciousness struggles to process. In various dream theophany texts, where gods appear to kings in sleep, the dreamer typically describes paralysis, inability to respond, being overwhelmed by presence and voice. But gods didn't usually speak directly to most humans. The gap between divine and mortal nature was too great. Instead, They communicated through various mediatory systems, all of which involved interpreting signs rather than hearing clear speech. Omens became crucial. If you couldn't hear the gods speaking directly, you learned to read their communication in natural phenomena. A particular pattern in sheep livers during sacrifice meant the gods approved or disapproved of a proposed action. Unusual weather patterns carried messages. Dreams, especially recurring dreams or dreams with vivid imagery, contained divine communication that trained interpreters could decode. The Sumerians and their successors developed elaborate omen systems, cataloged in massive collections of tablets. If the liver has such and such marking, the king will triumph in battle. If lightning strikes from the east, the harvest will fail. If a man dreams of climbing a mountain and reaching the summit, he will achieve his goals. Thousands upon thousands of these interpretive formulas existed, passed down through scribal schools, refined through generations of observation. This might seem like primitive superstition to modern minds, but consider what the Sumerians were doing, developing systematic methods for detecting patterns in complex phenomena, creating interpretive frameworks that allowed for making predictions, establishing protocols for decision-making under uncertainty. These are fundamentally rational activities, even if the underlying cosmological assumptions differ from ours. The conviction that gods communicated through signs also meant that nothing was purely accidental. Everything potentially carried meaning. A bird flying across your path wasn't random chance. It was possible divine message. A snake appearing in an unusual place wasn't mere animal behavior. It might be a god attempting to communicate warning or guidance. This created a world alive with potential significance. Every event, every encounter, every unusual occurrence had to be evaluated. Was this natural accident or divine message? Should I consult a priest to interpret this? Should I adjust my behavior based on what this might mean? Living in such a world required constant vigilance and interpretation. You couldn't just move through life ignoring signs. You had to pay attention, had to try to read divine intention in the patterns of existence. The gods were present, the gods were communicating, and missing an important message could have terrible consequences. But the most important divine-human communication happened in the temples, during the formal rituals where trained priests spoke for the gods and to the gods simultaneously. These priests occupied a unique position as intermediaries, human beings who had been trained and sanctified to cross the boundary, to speak with borrowed divine authority, to serve as conduits through which divine power flowed into the human realm. The training of a priest in ancient Mesopotamia began in childhood and lasted decades. Young boys, and in some cases girls, particularly for certain goddess cults, entered temple service around age 7 or 8. They began with menial tasks, cleaning, carrying water, assisting senior priests. But they also began memorization, learning hymns and formulas that would eventually enable them to perform rituals. As they matured, their training intensified. They learned cuneiform script, becoming literate in an era when literacy was rare and precious. They studied the ritual texts, the omen catalogs, the mythological traditions. They learned the proper gestures, the correct postures, the appropriate movements for various ceremonies. They underwent purification rituals repeatedly, training their bodies and spirits to handle proximity to divine power. By the time a priest was ready for full ritual duties, typically in his 20s or 30s, he had spent most of his life in preparation. He knew hundreds of hymns by heart. He could perform dozens of different ceremonies without consulting texts. He understood the theological complexities of divine nature and divine human relationships. He had been transformed from an ordinary human into a ritual specialist capable of mediating divine presence. These priests didn't just serve the gods. They became, in certain limited ways, like the gods. During rituals, especially major ceremonies, priests would sometimes wear masks representing divine faces. They would speak in first person as the deity. I am Enlil, Lord of the Air. They would perform actions that gods were believed to perform, embodying divine agency temporarily. This wasn't theater, at least not in our modern sense. The priest wearing an Enlil mask and speaking as Enlil wasn't pretending to be Enlil or symbolically representing him. Through correct ritual and divine authorization, he was becoming Enlil's presence in human form, allowing the god to act in the physical world through a human body. The boundary between human and divine, which we tend to think of as absolute, was permeable in Sumerian theology. Humans couldn't become gods permanently, except in rare cases of deification after death. But they could temporarily embody divine presence, could serve as vessels through which divine power and consciousness operated, could speak with divine authority when ritual circumstances permitted it. This wasn't limited to priests. Kings during coronation rituals became temporarily divine. Priestesses during the sacred marriage became Inanna. Any human performing approved ritual with correct intention could, to varying degrees, participate in divine nature and divine action. What made this possible was divine speech. When the priest recited the formula that invoked Enlil's presence, when he spoke the words correctly with proper authorization, Enlil responded by manifesting through him. The divine speech spoken by human mouth created the reality it described, the priest becoming divine conduit. We might understand this psychologically, as altered states of consciousness induced by ritual performance. We might understand it sociologically, as role-playing that served important social functions. We might dismiss it as delusion or wishful thinking, but the Sumerians experienced it as genuine participation in divine reality, as moments when the boundary dissolved and gods genuinely walked among them, speaking through human voices, acting through human hands. The dark side of divine presence, when gods were dangerous. We've mostly looked at the Sumerian gods as protectors and providers, beings who handed down wisdom and shaped human life for the better. But honestly, there's a much darker side to the stories. The old texts don't sugarcoat it. The gods had power, real power, and it wasn't always used for good. Sometimes, just being near them was dangerous. The Anunnaki weren't gentle guides or loving guardians. They had their own motives, their own fights, and they could be cruel, angry, or just plain destructive. Take the flood story. The gods didn't wipe out humanity because people were wicked in some moral sense. That's more of a biblical twist. In the Sumerian version, the problem was simple. Humans were noisy, they were everywhere, and the gods got fed up with it. So they decided to wipe everyone out, just like that. Enki's the only reason people survived at all, and even then he didn't exactly go head-to-head with the rest of the gods. He bent the rules, found loopholes, and did what he could from the shadows. He had to sneak around the divine council, break his oath, and warn people indirectly. The whole thing shows how unpredictable and even unfair the gods could be. Other gods saw the flood as excessive, but no one dared challenge Enlil openly. Nobody wanted to throw the universe into chaos. Other myths go even further. In the story of Adapa, a fisherman in Enki's service, things go sideways when Adapa accidentally breaks the south wind's wing. The winds were more than just air, they had a kind of divinity themselves. So Anu, the king of the gods, drags Adapa up to heaven to answer for what he's done. Before Adapa goes, Enki warns him, "Don't eat or drink anything up there or you'll die. Mortal bodies just can't handle divine food." But here's the twist. When Adapa gets to heaven, Anu actually offers him the bread and water of eternal life. If Adapa takes it, humanity gets a shot at immortality. But Adapa, trusting Enki's warning, refuses. He comes back to Earth as mortal as ever. Humanity misses its one shot at escaping death, all because the gods' gifts are as dangerous as their punishments. That's the theme. Divine gifts have a catch. The gods' world isn't safe for humans. Their very essence can kill or curse you. There's always risk in crossing from the human world into theirs, no matter how careful you are. Look at Inanna's descent. She's a major goddess, full of power, but to enter the underworld she has to strip away her divine protections, one by one at every gate. By the time she stands before Ereshkigal, she's naked and helpless. Her own sister kills her, hangs her corpse on a hook. If even Inanna can die for crossing into another god's territory uninvited, what hope did regular people have? For ordinary folks, the risks were everywhere. Accidentally anger a god, wander into a sacred place, or mess up a ritual, and you could be doomed. Even something as minor as speaking a god's name wrong or skipping purification before entering a temple could bring sickness or death. Break a taboo, even by accident, and your whole family might pay the price. Those temples we talk about, places where gods lived, were also places of danger. Sure, the gods were there, but strict rules kept most people at a distance. Only those with official permission, only people who had purified themselves could get close. The wrong person in the wrong spot. Disaster. Archaeology backs this up. Temples were built like fortresses, with gates and walls marking off sacred zones. Ordinary people could only go so far. Purified worshippers could get a little closer. Priests could enter the temple itself, but only the high priest could step into the innermost room where the god's statue stood. These rules weren't just about keeping people out. The Sumerians believed divine power got stronger the closer you got to the god. The inner sanctum was the hottest core. Step in unprepared and it could kill you, like standing next to a nuclear reactor with no protection. Rituals and rules were the only shield. Without them, the god's presence was just too much to survive. There are texts describing what happened when this system broke down. During wars, when enemy armies conquered cities and looted temples, soldiers who entered the inner sanctum and touched the cult statues often died within days. The texts attribute this to divine vengeance. Modern scholars might attribute it to disease, to psychological shock, to various natural causes. But the pattern repeated often enough that temple looting became associated with supernatural danger that not even victorious armies could ignore. The gods' emotional volatility also posed danger. Like the Greek gods, though generally less petty and vindictive, the Mesopotamian deities could become angry for reasons that seemed disproportionate to human observers. Inanna in particular was famous for violent rages. In one myth, she destroys an entire mountain because a shepherd refused her romantic advances. In another, she threatens to release the dead from the underworld to devour the living because her father won't give her what she wants. These weren't the tantrums of spoiled children. These were threats backed by genuine cosmic power. When Inanna threatened to break down the gates of the underworld, Anu and Enlil took her seriously. When she demanded the bull of heaven to punish Gilgamesh for rejecting her, Anu reluctantly gave it to her, knowing the destruction it would cause but unable to deny a great goddess without risking even worse consequences. Living with gods who possessed such power and such emotional unpredictability required constant care. You had to maintain proper respect. You had to perform correct rituals. You had to avoid giving offense. And even then, you could be caught in the crossfire of divine conflicts that had nothing to do with you. When Enlil and Enki disagreed about humanity's fate, humans suffered the consequences. The plague, drought, and famine that Enlil sent before finally deciding on the flood weren't targeted at specific wicked individuals. They fell on everyone, punishing the innocent along with whatever guilty parties had annoyed the gods. The Sumerians accepted this as inevitable reality. The gods were powerful. Humans were weak. Sometimes divine power crushed humans through no particular fault of their own, just as natural disasters killed indiscriminately. You couldn't control the gods any more than you could control earthquakes or floods. You could only try to stay in their good graces and hope for the best. This created a worldview very different from later monotheistic religions where God is defined as perfectly good and just. The Mesopotamian gods were powerful but not necessarily good. They could be benevolent or malevolent depending on circumstances and mood. They could protect you or destroy you. The wise human approached them with fear as much as love, with careful protocol as much as devotion. The concept of divine law reflects this. When we think of divine law in the Abrahamic traditions, we tend to think of moral commandments. Don't murder, don't steal, don't commit adultery. These are understood as expressions of God's moral nature, as laws that reflect ultimate goodness and justice. Mesopotamian divine law was different. The gods decreed laws not because the laws were morally good in abstract sense, but because the gods willed them. The laws reflected divine preference, divine convenience, divine order. They were to be obeyed not because they were right, but because disobeying gods was dangerous. This isn't to say Mesopotamian law was purely arbitrary. Many laws served obvious social functions. Prohibitions on murder and theft maintained social order. Laws protecting widows and orphans showed divine concern for the vulnerable. But the ultimate justification wasn't moral goodness. It was divine authority. When Hammurabi published his famous law code around 1750 BCE, the prologue didn't argue that these laws were good or just. It stated that Shamash, the sun god of justice, had given these laws to Hammurabi. The laws were valid because they came from divine source, not because they could be demonstrated as ethically superior to other possible legal arrangements. This divine authority could also be invoked to justify practices that modern ethics would condemn. Warfare conducted under divine mandate wasn't subject to moral criticism. If Inanna blessed your army and commanded conquest, the resulting destruction was divine will. Slavery sanctioned by divine order was legitimate. Harsh punishments decreed by divine law were just. The Sumerians weren't moral monsters. They valued kindness, generosity, honesty, and other virtues. But their ethics were grounded in divine command rather than abstract moral reasoning. What the gods commanded was good. What they forbade was bad. The standard was external and absolute, not because it reflected discovered moral truth, but because it reflected divine will that couldn't be questioned without catastrophic consequences. Living in such a world meant living with genuine fear alongside genuine devotion. You loved the gods because they protected you, provided for you, gave life meaning and structure. But you also feared them because they could destroy you, because their power was immense and their patience limited, because even faithful service didn't guarantee protection from divine wrath if circumstances aligned against you. The balance between fear and love, between awe and dread, between gratitude and terror, this was the emotional reality of Sumerian religion. The gods walked among them. This was tremendous blessing, but it was also tremendous danger. Divine presence was the source of all good things and the source of all existential threats. You couldn't have one without the other. The legacy. What happened when the gods departed? By the time Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, ending Mesopotamian independence forever, something fundamental had changed in the religious landscape. The gods were still worshipped, temples still functioned, rituals still continued, but the sense of immediate divine presence that characterized early Sumerian civilization had faded almost entirely. The priests still awakened the cult statues each morning. They still fed them, clothed them, spoke to them. But increasingly these acts had become rote performance, tradition maintained from inertia rather than from living conviction that gods were actually present in the statues, actually consuming the offerings, actually dwelling in the temples. The shift happened gradually over millennia. Each generation experienced slightly less immediate divine presence than the one before. Each century saw gods become slightly more remote, slightly less accessible. By the late first millennium BCE, the transformation was complete. The age when Anunnaki walked among Sumerians had become mythological past, remembered but not experienced. What caused this withdrawal? The texts hint at multiple factors without giving definitive answers. The flood marked a major turning point. After that catastrophe, the gods established new rules that created more distance between divine and human realms. The increasing size and complexity of civilizations made direct divine-human interaction less practical. The gods' own conflicts and politics perhaps required them to spend more time managing celestial affairs and less time on earthly matters. Or perhaps, and this is speculation, but speculation grounded in the trajectory the texts themselves describe, perhaps the withdrawal was intentional, a planned transition. Maybe the gods came to establish civilization, to teach humans the skills and knowledge needed for urban life, to set structures in place. And once those structures were functioning, once humans could maintain civilization without constant divine supervision, the gods stepped back. Not abandoning humanity entirely, but allowing humans more independence, more responsibility for their own affairs. This interpretation would align with patterns in the mythology. Enki particularly is portrayed as teacher figure, as God who gives knowledge and skills to humans, who wants them to succeed independently rather than remaining perpetually dependent on divine guidance. Perhaps his approach eventually prevailed over Enlil's more authoritarian style. Perhaps the Anunnaki collectively decided that humanity had matured enough to be left largely alone. Whether this withdrawal was planned or accidental, whether it reflected divine decision or human psychological change, whether it was real or imagined, the effects were profound. As direct divine presence faded, humans had to develop new ways of relating to the sacred, new institutions for maintaining civilization without constant divine input. Philosophy emerged as humans tried to understand ethics and cosmic order through reason, rather than relying solely on divine revelation. Natural philosophy, early science, developed as humans studied the world directly rather than assuming all knowledge came from gods. Political theory advanced as kingdoms justified their authority through secular arguments alongside or instead of pure divine mandate. This wasn't simple progress from primitive religion to enlightened reason. It was loss as much as gain. The certainty that gods were present, that divine help was available, that cosmic forces cared about human welfare. This comfort disappeared along with immediate divine presence. Humans gained independence but lost security, gained intellectual freedom but lost existential certainty. The physical remains of Sumerian civilization speak to this loss. The great ziggurats, those massive platforms built to house divine beings, gradually fell into disrepair. Without gods actually living there, without priests genuinely believing in divine presence requiring service, the motivation to maintain these enormous structures weakened. Modern archaeologists exploring these ruins find something poignant. The ziggurat at Uruk, for example, shows evidence of increasingly shoddy repair work in later periods. Earlier bricks were precisely made, carefully laid. Later additions used inferior materials, less careful craftsmanship. It's as if the later builders were going through the motions, maintaining tradition without the driving conviction that quality mattered because gods were watching. Eventually, the temples were abandoned entirely. The last cuneiform tablet at Babylon dates to 75 CE, over 600 years after Persia conquered the region. For 6 centuries, the old religion limped along, maintained by increasingly small communities of traditionalists. Then silence. The temples fell empty. The statues were carted off by looters or left to crumble. The rituals stopped. The gods, if they had ever walked those streets, were gone. But the memory persisted. Biblical writers preserved Mesopotamian flood narratives and creation myths, transforming them to fit monotheistic theology. Greek philosophers studied Babylonian astronomy and incorporated Mesopotamian mathematical knowledge. Islamic scholars in Baghdad centuries later worked to translate and preserve whatever Mesopotamian texts survived. The idea of gods walking among humans, of divine beings taking physical form and dwelling in specific locations, influenced religions across the ancient world. Egyptian pharaohs claimed divine nature. Greek gods descended from Olympus to interact with mortals. Roman emperors were deified. The concept spread, mutated, evolved, but the core idea persisted. The boundary between human and divine could be crossed. Gods could become present in human world. divine power could manifest in physical form. Christianity would later develop the ultimate expression of this idea, God himself becoming human, walking the earth, dying and rising again. The incarnation doctrine, that the divine literally became flesh, echoes Mesopotamian concepts of gods embodying themselves in physical forms, dwelling among humans, making themselves accessible to mortal touch and sight. Whether this represents continuity of real truth gradually clarifying across millennia, or continuity of human psychological need projecting itself into various theological systems, depends on your perspective. What's undeniable is the persistence of the pattern, humans seeking divine presence, developing beliefs and practices to access it, building structures to house it, creating rituals to maintain it. The Sumerians were among the first to codify this seeking, to build their entire civilization around it, to develop sophisticated systems for managing divine-human interaction. They left us the oldest written records of temple worship, of daily divine service, of humans trying to maintain relationship with powers vastly greater than themselves. When you visit Mesopotamian ruins today, the ziggurat at Ur, the site of ancient Uruk, the excavated temples at Tel Asmar, you're walking through the remains of this ancient experiment. Millions of mud bricks still testify to the labor invested in building houses for gods. Thousands of clay tablets still preserve the formulas used to invoke divine presence. The broken statues still show the craftsmanship devoted to creating worthy images of beings believed to be actually present, actually watching, actually requiring human service. Stand in those ruins at dawn, when light first touches the crumbling platforms. Let yourself feel the weight of history, the accumulation of faith and doubt, hope and fear, certainty and questioning that characterized 4,000 years of Mesopotamian religion. Imagine the priests climbing those stairs at dawn to awaken their gods. Imagine the citizens bringing offerings. Imagine the sense of living in a world populated not just by humans, but by divine beings who shared space with them, who required care from them, who protected and threatened and guided and tested them. That world is gone. The gods departed or retreated or perhaps were never there in the way the Sumerians believed. But the questions remain. What does it mean to be human in a cosmos that might contain powers beyond us? How should we relate to such powers if they exist? What structures, what rituals, what beliefs help us navigate existence in a universe whose ultimate nature remains mysterious despite all our scientific and philosophical advances? The Sumerians answered these questions by building ziggurats and performing daily divine service. We answer them differently now, but we're still asking, still seeking, still hoping that we're not entirely alone, that the cosmos might contain presence and consciousness and care beyond the merely human. Sleep now. Let the ancient world fade into dreams. The ziggurat still rises in your mind's eye, its white summit catching first light. The hymns still echo, voices rising in languages long dead. The gods, whether they walked those streets or only walked the imagination of those who believed, have left their footprints. And we follow those tracks still, millennia later, hoping they lead somewhere we need to go. Tomorrow the sun will rise as it always has, as it rose over Uruk and and Eridu, and all the cities that have vanished into dust. The same sun that Udu, the sun god, was believed to embody and guide. The same light that priests welcomed with morning hymns, believing the god was listening, was present, was blessing his city with another day of light and warmth and life. We understand that light differently now. Fusion reactions, electromagnetic radiation, photons traveling from sun to earth. But the sense of wonder, the moment of gratitude as darkness yields to dawn, the recognition that light makes life possible, these remain constant. Different explanations, same human experience, same deep human need to find meaning in the cycles that govern existence. The Anunnaki walked among Sumerians, or the Sumerians believed they did, which shaped their civilization just as powerfully as if the gods had been physically real. The distinction might matter less than we think, belief that shapes how you build your cities, organize your economy, structure your society, spend your time and resources. Such belief is real in its effects regardless of whether its objects truly exist. And so the ancient experiment continues in new forms, as it always has, as it always will. Humans seeking the divine, building structures to contain it, developing practices to invoke it, hopping against hope that we're not alone, that the universe contains presence and purpose beyond what we can fully grasp or prove. Rest in that ancient hope tonight. Sleep in the shadow of ziggurats that no longer stand. Dream of gods who may or may not have walked dusty streets 4,000 years ago. The boundary between then and now, between myth and history, between divine and human, grows thin in the hours before dawn. And perhaps in that thinness something whispers still. The old truths, the eternal questions, the Sumerian certainty that gods once walked among them, and the nagging modern uncertainty about whether anything like that could ever be true, or whether it matters if it was. Good night, sleep well. The ancient world keeps its secrets but shares its wisdom freely with those patient enough to listen, humble enough to wonder, brave enough to ask whether the boundaries we take for granted might be less absolute than we assume. The gods may have departed, but their memory remains, preserved in crumbling clay and enduring human longing for connection with something greater than ourselves. The sacred geography, how divine presence shaped the Mesopotamian landscape. The Sumerians didn't look at their world as a blank slate. For them, the land was already alive with gods long before any human showed up. Rivers, mountains, every hill and bend in the land, these weren't just scenery. Everything belonged to the gods. Everything meant something. Take the Tigris and Euphrates. People didn't see them as just rivers. They were the gods' gift, real physical proof that the divine was close. Enki, the god of fresh water, didn't just create the rivers and walk away. He kept them flowing day after day. If he pulled back, the water would stop. The land would dry up. Civilization would die. So when people built those famous irrigation canals, they weren't just showing off their engineering. Sure, they dug the channels and kept the water moving, but none of that mattered without Enki's blessing. You needed the god's permission to move his water around. Otherwise, it just wouldn't work. Digging a canal was part construction, part sacred ritual. Before any big project, the king asked Enki for his blessing. Priests walked alongside the workers, chanting prayers to keep the god on their side. When they finished a canal, they threw a ceremony, offerings, processions, the whole deal to dedicate it to Enki or the local gods. They even named their canals after the gods. Things like Enlil is the abundance of the land or Enki gives life. These names weren't just poetic. They were reminders. This water is a gift, a piece of the divine handed over for people to use. Mountains were different. They marked the edge of the world people knew, and the start of a place where foreign gods ruled, sometimes dangerous, always powerful. The Zagros Mountains, where the Tigris begins, belonged to deities who controlled rain and snow. Anyone heading into those mountains for lumber or stone had to ask the gods permission first. Sacrifice, prayer, you didn't mess around. Fast forward a few thousand years, and even in the 1900s, American archaeologists in Kurdistan found the local Kurds still believed in mountain spirits. Maybe these traditions came straight from ancient times, maybe not. Either way, it shows how people keep seeing the land itself as sacred, especially when the landscape is wild and dramatic. Some places on the plain were extra holy. Nippur was the big one. It wasn't the largest city and never the richest. It wasn't even the political capital, but it was the religious heart. Enlil lived there in his mountain house, at least that's what people believed. Kings fought for the chance to rebuild Nippur's temples. It wasn't about politics. It was about showing devotion, earning the gods' favor. Keep Nippur's holy spaces in good shape, and you proved you were worthy to rule. Let it fall into ruin, and you risked disaster, war, drought, whatever the gods felt like sending. Enlil's temple, the Eker, was described as the center of the universe. Its foundations reached all the way down to the underworld. Its roof nearly touched the sky. People believed it was the spot where heaven, earth, and the land of the dead came together. From that point, divine energy spread out and kept the world running. This wasn't just a story. People took it literally. Nippur really was the world's center. The very structure of the universe depended on keeping that spot sacred. Archaeologists digging there found the temple rebuilt again and again, always in the same place, always keeping the sacred layout that linked earth and sky. Other places had their own spiritual weight. Eridu, for example, was where fresh water burst up from the deep, the spot where Enki first touched the world. Pilgrims would come from all over just to drink from its springs, believing water closest to the source held special power. The journey to Eridu became itself a sacred act. Texts describe kings making pilgrimage to the ancient city, bringing offerings to Enki, seeking wisdom or blessing. The route from major cities like Uruk or to Eridu was well established, marked by way stations where pilgrims could rest and resupply. These journeys weren't just travel. They were ritual processionals, movements through sacred space that connected the pilgrim more deeply to divine reality. Certain natural features also carried divine presence. Specific groves of date palms were sacred to Inanna, protected by taboos against cutting or damaging the trees. Particular hills or mounds were understood as the burial places of ancient heroes or the dwelling places of minor deities. Even individual springs could have their own tutelary spirits, their own local traditions of offering and prayer. This created a landscape alive with meaning, saturated with divine presence at different levels of intensity. You couldn't move through Mesopotamian geography without constantly encountering the sacred. A farmer walking to his field past Inanna's sacred grove nodded respectfully, perhaps left a small offering of dates or bread. A traveler stopped at a spring, poured libation before drinking, acknowledged the spirit of the place. A merchant boat floating down the Euphrates had its prow decorated with images of river gods, its captain reciting prayers for safe passage. The underworld also had geographical reality in Sumerian thought. It wasn't purely spiritual realm. It was physical place, located beneath the earth's surface, accessible through certain caves and chasms that marked entrances to the land of the dead. The most important of these entrances was believed to be near Eridu, connecting that city not just to the cosmic waters above but to the realm of death below. Journeys to the underworld, rare and dangerous in mythological accounts, always involved physical travel to specific locations. Inanna didn't simply will herself into the underworld. She traveled there, arriving at 7 gates that marked the boundary between living world and dead. Gilgamesh, seeking his dead friend Enkidu, had to travel to the edge of the world, to the mountains of Mashu where the sun sets, to find the tunnel that led down into the underworld. This geographical specificity gave the underworld tangible reality. It wasn't abstraction. It was place you could theoretically reach if you knew the way and were brave, or foolish, enough to attempt the journey. The dead who descended there after death weren't vanishing into nothingness. They were traveling to a location, a grim and unpleasant location, but nevertheless a real place within the cosmos. The sense of living in a world where every significant feature of the landscape connected to divine presence and divine history shaped how Sumerians moved through their environment. Modern people, especially in urban settings, tend to experience space as neutral, as merely the stage where human activity occurs. The Sumerians experienced space as inherently meaningful, as telling divine stories, as manifesting divine power in physical form. This made them profoundly conservative about geography. You didn't casually alter the landscape. You didn't dam rivers without divine permission. You didn't level sacred hills to build farmland. You didn't cut sacred groves to extend cities. The land itself had divine owners, divine associations, divine significance that constrained human action. When cities were built or expanded, planners had to account for sacred geography. A new city wall might have to curve around a sacred tree or spring rather than destroying it. Streets were laid out to provide clear sightlines to important temples. Gates were positioned to align with astronomical phenomena important to particular gods. The entire urban fabric reflected and reinforced the cosmic order, creating built environment that harmonized with divine presence. This way of relating to land and space offers something we've largely lost in modern industrial societies: the sense that place matters beyond its utility, that geography carries meaning beyond its resources or strategic position, that we move through a world that isn't purely material but contains layers of significance we need to acknowledge and respect. The fall of the gods. When Babylon surrendered without a fight. October 539 BCE. Cyrus the Great of Persia stood before the gates of Babylon, greatest city of the ancient world. Inside those walls, which the Greek historian Herodotus described as so wide that chariot teams could turn around on their tops, the last Neo-Babylonian king Nabonidus waited with his army and his gods. Cyrus had conquered most of the ancient Near East. The Median Empire had fallen. Lydia had submitted. The Greek cities of Asia Minor had yielded. Only Babylon remained, protected by walls that had never been breached by foreign armies, by gods who had protected the city for thousands of years. And then the gates opened. Without battle, without siege, the city surrendered. The cuneiform records preserve Cyrus's own account. He claimed that Marduk, the great god of Babylon, had become disgusted with Nabonidus's religious policies. The king had neglected the proper rituals, had moved divine statues from their rightful temples, had elevated the moon god Sin above Marduk in the divine hierarchy. And so Marduk invited Cyrus, the Persian conqueror, to enter Babylon as liberator. Whether you believe this divine explanation or attribute it to propaganda, the effect was the same. Babylon, the city where gods had walked for over 2,000 years, surrendered without forcing its gods to defend it. The divine protection that had shielded the city for millennia failed or was withdrawn. The age of Mesopotamian independence ended. The age when native kings served native gods in native temples was over. Cyrus was politically shrewd. He didn't destroy the temples. He didn't exile the priests. He didn't impose Persian religion on his new subjects. Instead, he presented himself as the servant of Marduk, as the god's chosen instrument to restore proper worship. He returned divine statues that Nabonidus had relocated. He funded temple repairs. He participated in traditional festivals. But something fundamental had changed. The city was now ruled by a foreign king who worshipped different gods, who came from a different tradition, who saw Mesopotamian religion as tool of political control rather than as sacred truth. The priests continued their rituals, but they did so at the pleasure of Persian overlords who could withdraw support at any time. For over 2 centuries, under Persian rule, Mesopotamian religion continued. The daily awakening of gods in their temples proceeded as it had for thousands of years. The festivals celebrated ancient patterns. New kings still sought legitimacy by participating in Babylonian rituals, by claiming divine selection from Marduk. But divine presence was fading. Fewer divine dreams were reported. Fewer miraculous interventions occurred. Fewer people experienced the intense sense of gods being immediately present, immediately responsive, immediately involved in human affairs. The boundary between divine and human realms thickened, became less permeable. Then came Alexander the Great in 331 BCE. The Macedonian conqueror arrived in Babylon intending to rebuild Enlil's ziggurat, which had fallen into disrepair. He ordered the rubble cleared, the foundations prepared. But he died in Babylon in 323 BCE before the project could proceed. After his death, his generals divided his empire, and Babylon became a pawn in their conflicts. The city was gradually abandoned. By the 1st century CE, most of it stood empty. Parthian and later Sasanian rulers occasionally visited the ruins, but they had their own capitals, their own sacred sites, their own gods. The Mesopotamian temples fell silent. The last cuneiform tablet, as mentioned earlier, dates to 75 CE. After that, nothing. When Islamic armies conquered the region in the 7th century CE, they found ruins. Massive ruins, impressive even in decay, but empty of living religious tradition. The knowledge of cuneiform had been lost. The meaning of the inscriptions on the walls was forgotten. The names of the gods were unknown. The ziggurats became tells, artificial hills whose purpose no one remembered. Looters and treasure hunters dug into them, destroying archaeological evidence, scattering artifacts. Bricks from ancient temples were reused in modern construction. The palaces of Nebuchadnezzar became quarries for building materials. For over 1,000 years, Mesopotamian civilization was forgotten. European travelers occasionally reported strange ruins in Uruk, massive platforms and crumbling walls. But no one understood what they were seeing. Biblical references to Babylon as wicked city and to the Tower of Babel created negative associations, but no real knowledge. The rediscovery began in the mid-19th century. French and British archaeologists, competing for national prestige and museum collections, began systematic excavations. Austin Henry Layard at Nineveh, Paul Emile Botta at Khorsabad, the University of Pennsylvania at Nippur, German teams at Babylon and Uruk. They uncovered libraries of clay tablets. They found massive architectural remains. They discovered art and artifacts demonstrating sophisticated civilization. And slowly, painstakingly, they learned to read cuneiform, to understand the languages written in those wedge-shaped marks, to hear the voices of people who had been silent for 2 millennia. What they learned challenged prevailing assumptions about biblical history and ancient civilization. These texts predated the Bible by thousands of years. These cities showed urban planning and literacy before Greece or Rome existed. These religious systems demonstrated theological complexity that belied stereotypes about primitive polytheism. American scholars became heavily involved in this rediscovery. The University of Pennsylvania's Nippur expedition, which ran from 1888 to 1900, retrieved thousands of tablets that became the foundation of Sumerian studies. American institutions like the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago sponsored major excavations throughout the 20th century. These American Assyriologists and Sumerologists, people like Samuel Noah Kramer, Thorkild Jacobson, William Hallow, dedicated their careers to understanding Mesopotamian civilization. They produced grammars and dictionaries that made the ancient languages accessible. They translated texts and published them in academic journals and books. They trained new generations of scholars to continue the work. What emerged from this century and a half of scholarship was a nuanced picture of Mesopotamian religion. Not the simple mythology that early excavators expected, but complex theology that wrestled with profound questions about divine nature, divine human relations, the meaning of existence, the structure of cosmos, the origins of civilization. The texts revealed that Sumerians and their successors believed gods walked among them, not as vague metaphor, not as primitive superstition, but as theological claim, carefully articulated, consistently maintained across thousands of years, expressed through architecture and ritual and daily practice. Whether these gods actually existed and actually walked those ancient streets remains a question that scholarship cannot answer. The evidence shows what the Sumerians believed, how that belief shaped their civilization, what practices they developed based on those beliefs. Whether the beliefs corresponded to objective reality is a different category of question, one that requires faith or skepticism rather than academic methodology to answer. What's undeniable is the power of the belief. The Sumerians built the world's first cities because they believed gods required houses. They developed writing to keep records of divine property. They created mathematics and astronomy to track the movements of celestial gods. They established law codes because gods demanded justice. Everything we recognize as civilization emerged from or was profoundly shaped by their conviction that divine beings dwelt among them, required service, deserved worship. The eternal questions, what the Sumerians still ask us. 4,000 years stand between us and the world of the Sumerians. Their language is gone. Their cities crumble. If their gods ever existed, they've long since slipped away. And yet, the big questions those people struggled with, they're still here, just as sharp. What happens when we brush up against the divine? How do we deal with powers we can't understand or control? What do they want from us? Can we hope for anything from them? What are we supposed to fear? The Sumerians tried to work all this out by building ziggurats and serving in their temples every day. They built whole systems to manage how humans and gods interacted, wrapped everything in theology, and basically shaped their society around staying on good terms with these mysterious, demanding presences. We do it differently now. Some of us keep up religious practices, but the gods and beliefs look different. Others go at these questions from a philosophical angle, chasing meaning without feeling sure there's anything divine at all. Plenty just ignore the whole thing, figuring life is physical and that's that. Still, even the skeptics bump up against the old questions. Where does morality come from? Why does the world feel charged with meaning and purpose? What do we do with those moments, maybe rare, maybe fleeting, when awe or wonder stops us in our tracks, even if we don't believe in anything supernatural? For the Sumerians, the answer was clear. The gods are real, they're here, and they want something from us. That's not how most of us see things now, but the questions haven't gone anywhere. And the fact that they built their whole civilization, its rituals, its buildings, its social rhythms, around these questions shows just how important they thought this stuff was. Honestly, maybe the Sumerians' biggest lesson is that humans need to feel connected to something bigger than just daily chores and business. Cities can't run on logistics and commerce alone. People need sacred places, spaces set apart, rituals that pull everyone out of their routines and bind them together in something that feels important. Ziggurats did this. They weren't practical in the usual sense. You couldn't live in them or store grain or fend off enemies, but they stood at the center, looming over everything, a reminder that life was hooked into the cosmos, that there was more to existence than getting by. Take a look at modern cities. Our skylines are all offices and apartments. Public spaces exist to move people and sell stuff. The idea that our buildings should reflect some bigger meaning, we've let that slip. Sure, there are exceptions. Washington, D.C. was laid out with symbolism in mind, monuments, avenues, a certain kind of grandeur. Some churches, mosques, or temples still give cities a symbolic heart, but more and more our cities are designed to serve functions, not feed the spirit. The Sumerians remind us what we've let fade and what we might still need. Not their specific gods or rituals, but the insight that people need more than comfort and jobs. We crave meaning, transcendence, a link to something beyond ourselves. We need spaces and times that break the spell of routine. We need rituals, whatever form they take, that draw us together and make us feel like we're part of something that matters. Maybe you find that in religion, maybe in civic ceremonies or music or art or wild places, or maybe you're still searching for it or inventing it as you go. Doesn't matter. The need is the thing. The Sumerians tried to meet it by inviting the gods in and organizing everything around them. We have to find our own way or risk creating a world that has everything but the thing that makes it worth living. So as you settle in tonight, ask yourself, what's sacred in your life? What places or moments feel set apart, important beyond just being useful? What rituals tie you to others or to something larger than yourself? What beliefs, what habits pull you out of the everyday and remind you that there's more? The Sumerians would point to their temples, their rituals, their sense that the gods were close and watching. Your answers won't match theirs, but their questions, they're still yours, still mine, still as urgent and as human as ever, no matter how much the world changes. Perhaps this is the deepest gift the Sumerians offer us. Not answers. Their specific answers came from their context and may not transfer to ours, but questions. The eternal questions about meaning, purpose, transcendence, the possibility of divine presence, the structure of cosmos, our place within it, our obligations and our hopes. These questions don't go away with scientific advancement or social change. They're built into human consciousness, into our capacity for wonder and our need for meaning. Every civilization must address them somehow. The Sumerians did so by creating the world's first urban society organized around serving gods they believed dwelt among them. We're still working out our answers, still building our ziggurats, though we call them by other names, still seeking divine presence, though we might understand divinity very differently than the Sumerians did, still hopping that we're not alone in the cosmos, that existence has meaning beyond what we can create through our own efforts, that connection to something greater than ourselves is possible. The Anunnaki walked among Sumerians, or the Sumerians believed they did, which amounts to the same thing in terms of civilizational impact. That belief shaped architecture, economy, law, art, literature, daily life. It created patterns that influenced subsequent civilizations across the ancient Near East and eventually the entire world. Whether the gods were real or imagined, their effects were undeniably real, and the human need they addressed, the need for meaning, for transcendence, for connection to powers beyond ourselves, remains real regardless of whether any gods exist to fulfill it. Sleep in this knowledge tonight. Rest in the shadow of questions that have haunted humanity since we first built cities and looked up at stars and wondered about our place in the cosmos. The Sumerians are gone. Their gods are silent or departed, but the questions remain, as alive and urgent now as when those first priests climbed the ziggurat stairs at dawn to awaken the gods and begin another day of service to powers they hoped were watching, caring, present in the world they'd helped to build. The boundary between sleep and waking grows thin. The boundary between past and present dissolves. The boundary between myth and history, between divine and human, between what we know and what we wonder, all of these boundaries soften and blur. And in that liminal space, the ancient voices whisper still, the priests chanting dawn hymns, the kings proclaiming divine mandate, the scribes recording careful accounts of divine property, the builders laying brick upon brick to create mountains for gods, the faithful bringing offerings, the skeptics questioning, the wise teaching that gods once walked among us and might walk again. Listen, rest. Let the ancient wisdom wash over you like the waters of the Euphrates flowing from the mountains to the sea, carrying sediment that builds land, that makes life possible, that connects the heights to the depths in eternal cycle. The gods walked among Sumerians. Perhaps they walk among us still, unrecognized, calling to us in languages we've forgotten how to speak. Perhaps they departed and left only echoes. Perhaps they were never there except in human hearts and minds projecting need and hope onto cosmic screen. It doesn't matter. Not tonight. Tonight, in the space between waking and dreams, let the ancient stories speak. Let the ziggurats rise again in your mind's eye. Let the gods walk the streets of cities that vanished into dust millennia ago. Let yourself wonder what it would mean if divine presence were possible, if the boundary between heaven and earth could be crossed, if beings of power and wisdom cared enough about humanity to dwell among us, to teach us, to guide us, to demand our service and offer their protection. The Sumerians believed all of this was true. They built their world on that belief. And their world, for all its strangeness to our modern eyes, worked. It functioned. It sustained them for thousands of years, longer than our own civilization has existed, longer than we can reasonably predict ours will last. Perhaps they knew something we've forgotten. Perhaps their gods were real in ways we can no longer perceive. Perhaps belief itself creates reality in domains we don't fully understand. Perhaps the questions matter more than the answers, the seeking more than the finding, the building of ziggurats more than whether any god descends to dwell in them. Rest now. Sleep. Dream of ancient cities and distant gods. Dream of a time when the divine walked among the human, when every day began with awakening the gods and ended with putting them to sleep, when the world was alive with presence and meaning and purpose. Tomorrow you'll wake to a different world. But tonight, in dreams, you might walk the streets of Uruk, might hear the hymns rising from temple courtyards, might glimpse the gods the Sumerians served with such devotion and such hope. Good night, sleep well, and may whatever gods there are, if any gods there are, watch over your sleeping and your waking, as the Sumerians believed they watched over theirs, as humans have hoped for throughout our long, strange, beautiful journey through time and history, and the endless questions that make us human. The ziggurat rises still, the gods walk still, in memory, in dreams, in the eternal human heart that seeks and hopes and wonders. Sleep.